Welcome to True Crime and Horror, where we dive into the most chilling and haunting true crime stories from across the globe. Today's case takes us to the quiet wilderness of New Mexico, where the body of a young man was found disfigured and abandoned in Carson National Forest. What followed was an intense investigation that unraveled a tangled web of betrayal, revenge, and a kidnapping gone terribly wrong. Join us as we delve into the life of Raymond James, a young man whose life spiraled into crime, and the events that led to his untimely and brutal death. This is a story of broken friendships, dangerous decisions, and a murder that shook the community to its core. Stay tuned, and remember to subscribe for more spine-chilling stories like this one. The body in Carson National Forest. It was a cold morning in late October when a jogger set out for their usual run along the serene trails of Carson National Forest. The morning mist clung to the ground, giving the landscape an eerie, ghostly feel. The sound of the jogger's footsteps echoed through the stillness of the forest, the only sound breaking the silence of the woods. But something was different that day. A strange, metallic scent hung in the air, faint at first but growing stronger as the jogger continued along the path. At first, the jogger thought nothing of it, attributing the smell to perhaps a dead animal nearby. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, the scent became overwhelming, impossible to ignore. The jogger's heart began to race, a sense of dread creeping up their spine as they slowed their pace, scanning the dense underbrush for the source of the odor. And then they saw it, a mound of leaves and dirt that seemed out of place, unnaturally disturbed. The jogger's stomach churned as they approached, the smell now almost unbearable. They bent down, cautiously pulling aside the leaves, and that's when they saw it, a body, or what was left of it. It was badly decomposed, the skin mottled and disfigured, almost unrecognizable as human. The joggers stumbled back in horror, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps as they fumbled for their phone to dial 911. Within the hour, the quiet forest was transformed into a crime scene. Yellow police tape cordoned off the area, and forensic teams carefully examined the remains, their faces grim beneath their masks. The body was so badly disfigured that it was impossible to identify the victim on sight. There were no belongings, no ID, nothing to give them a clue about who this person was or how they had ended up in the forest. The forensic team worked meticulously, taking samples and collecting evidence, but they knew it. The missing person search. Back at the station, investigators began the painstaking task of sifting through missing persons reports. They had a body, but no identity. The process was slow and methodical. Each report was cross-referenced with the physical description of the body, but with the level of disfigurement, it was difficult to make any immediate connections. Days passed with no breakthroughs, but the team refused to give up. They knew that somewhere, someone was missing their loved one, and they were determined to find out who this person was. Eventually, a name started to stand out. Raymond James, a 24-year-old from Albuquerque, had been reported missing by his girlfriend just over a week ago. He had disappeared without a trace, leaving his family and friends desperate for answers. But it was still just a hunch. There was no concrete proof that the body found in the forest was Raymond. To be sure, they would need to rely on science. DNA and fingerprint analysis would be the key to unlocking the mystery of the body's identity. Forensic scientists worked around the clock, taking samples from the body and comparing them to the missing person database. They also cross-referenced fingerprints stored in police records from an old arrest in Raymond's past, a small mistake that would now help solve this dark mystery. The results took several days to process, but when they finally came in, there was no doubt, the body found in Carson National Forest was indeed Raymond James. The investigation begins. With the victim identified, the investigation kicked into high gear. Now, the team had a new question to answer: who had killed Raymond James, and why? Leading the case was Detective Pamela Alvarez, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for being relentless in her pursuit of justice. Pamela had seen her share of gruesome cases, but something about Raymond's death struck a personal chord with her. Maybe it was his age, he was just 24, with so much life left to live. Or maybe it was the fact that he had come from a middle-class family, just like so many of the victims she had seen fall through the cracks. Pamela wasted no time diving into the investigation. She began by tracing Raymond's final days, speaking to his family, friends, and anyone who might have had contact with him in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Raymond's descent. Raymond James had grown up in a modest home in Albuquerque. His parents had worked hard to provide for him, and for most of his life, Raymond had been a good kid, a decent student, well-liked by his teachers and peers. But things had started to change in high school. Raymond struggled to keep up with his classes, and by the time he was 17, he had dropped out altogether. He found work as a car mechanic, a job that suited him at first. He liked working with his hands, and for a while, it seemed like he might be able to turn things around. But the money wasn't great, and Raymond soon found himself falling into bad habits. He started drinking more, and before long, he was experimenting with drugs. His job at the mechanic shop became less of a priority, and soon he was missing shifts, using all of his earnings to fuel his growing addiction. By the time he was 19, Raymond had moved out of his parents' home. He didn't want them to see the mess he had made of his life, so he crashed at a friend's place, drifting further and further from the person he had once been. His addiction took over, and soon he was dealing drugs to make ends meet. It was fast money, and Raymond found himself sinking deeper into the criminal underworld of Albuquerque. He was arrested a few times for petty crimes, drug possession, theft, nothing too serious. But each time, he managed to slip through the cracks, either by paying fines or serving short stints in jail. His parents tried to intervene, but by then, Raymond was too far gone. He was living life on his own terms, even if those terms were slowly destroying him. Cyril Smith, friend turned foe. One of Raymond's closest friends during this time was Cyril Smith, a man with a reputation for being both dangerous and unpredictable. Cyril was a small-time drug dealer, but unlike Raymond, he had been in the game for years. He knew how to navigate the criminal world, and he had connections that ran deep in Albuquerque's underbelly. Cyril had taken Raymond under his wing when they first met, supplying him with drugs and introducing him to the life of easy money. For a while, the two were inseparable, partners in crime as they dealt drugs and ran small-time scams together. But their friendship was built on shaky ground, a relationship of convenience more than loyalty. As time went on, tensions began to build between them. Raymond was reckless, often making decisions that put both of them in danger. Cyril, who prided himself on being methodical, grew increasingly frustrated with Raymond's behavior. But things really came to a head when a drug deal between them went wrong. Raymond had cheated Cyril out of a significant amount of money in the transaction. At first, Cyril tried to play it cool, pretending that it wasn't a big deal. But inside, he was seething. He had a reputation to uphold, and Raymond's betrayal had made him look weak. Cyril couldn't let it slide. He began plotting his revenge, biding his time until the perfect opportunity arose. The kidnapping. That opportunity came one night when Cyril, along with his two associates, Jonathan Stormhill and Graham Ferguson, decided to teach Raymond a lesson he would never forget. They lured Raymond into a trap, inviting him to meet them at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Albuquerque under the guise of a business deal. Raymond, oblivious to their true intentions, agreed to meet them, thinking it was just another night of easy money. When Raymond arrived at the warehouse, he was ambushed. Cyril and his associates grabbed him, binding his hands and feet before shoving him into the back of a van. Raymond struggled, yelling at Cyril to let him go, but Cyril's mind was already made up. "You shouldn't have crossed me, Ray," Cyril said coldly as he slammed the van doors shut. "Now, you're gonna pay." They drove him to a remote location outside the city, a dilapidated building where no one would hear his screams. Cyril's plan was simple: torture Raymond until he paid back the money he owed. But Raymond insisted he didn't have the money. He pleaded with Cyril, telling him he could get the cash if they just gave him more time. But Cyril wasn't interested in hearing excuses. The torture began slowly at first, a few punches, a kick to the ribs. But as Raymond continued to deny having the money, Cyril's frustration grew. The beatings became more severe, each blow designed to inflict maximum pain. Jonathan and Graham, who had been watching from the sidelines, started to feel uneasy. They hadn't signed up for murder. This was supposed to be a scare tactic, not a death sentence. As the hours dragged on, Raymond's cries of pain echoed through the abandoned building. Cyril was relentless, driven by rage and a need to assert his dominance. His two associates, Jonathan and Graham, exchanged nervous glances as the situation spiraled out of control. What had started as a plan to teach Raymond a lesson had devolved into something far darker and more dangerous. Cyril, consumed by anger, refused to listen to reason. He had his chance, Cyril spat, pacing around the bloodied Raymond. "He chose to screw me over." Jonathan and Graham hesitated. They knew things had gone too far, but neither was willing to stand up to Cyril. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air: this wasn't just about the money anymore. Cyril wanted to make Raymond suffer, to send a message to anyone else who dared to cross him. Hours passed, and Raymond's condition worsened. His face was swollen and bruised, his breathing labored. The torture had taken its toll, and his body couldn't withstand the abuse any longer. By the time Cyril realized Raymond wasn't responding anymore, it was too late. Raymond had died in their custody. Panic set in. Cyril, Jonathan, and Graham stood over the lifeless body, the weight of what they had done crashing down on them. This was no longer a simple case of intimidation, it was murder. The disposal, Cyril, ever the strategist, quickly shifted gears. "We need to get rid of the body," he said, his voice cold and detached. "No one can ever know what happened here." Jonathan and Graham were too shaken to argue. They followed Cyril's orders, wrapping Raymond's body in a tarp and loading him into the back of the van. The mood was tense, silent, as the three men drove toward Carson National Forest under the cover of darkness. The forest was vast, secluded, a perfect place to hide their crime. They drove deep into the woods, far from any main roads or hiking trails. When they found a remote spot, they pulled Raymond's body from the van and began the gruesome task of disfiguring him, making sure no one would recognize the body. They stripped him of any belongings, hoping to erase any trace of his identity. It was a grim, calculated act, but Cyril knew it was the only way to avoid being caught. Once they were finished, they buried the body beneath a shallow layer of leaves and dirt, praying that the wilderness would conceal their crime. They left the forest without looking back, but the weight of their actions clung to them like a shadow. 7 days later, for 7 days, the body lay undiscovered in the forest, slowly decomposing under the autumn leaves. During that time, Cyril and his associates tried to distance themselves from the crime, fleeing New Mexico and heading to Florida, hoping to outrun the consequences of their actions. But they couldn't outrun the guilt. Raymond's girlfriend had reported him missing just 2 days after he failed to come home, and an investigation had already begun. Friends and family told police that Raymond had fallen in with a bad crowd, including the first challenge was identifying the body. With no belongings and the body in a state of advanced decomposition, it was nearly impossible to make a visual identification. But Alvarez and her team were thorough. They took DNA samples from the body and sent them to the lab for comparison, while also checking for fingerprints. It was a long shot, but their persistence paid off. Raymond's fingerprints had been stored in the police database from a previous arrest, and the match was confirmed. The body in Carson National Forest was indeed Raymond James. Now that they knew who the victim was, the next question was why he had been killed, and by whom. The Special Task Force, Alvarez quickly assembled a special investigation team to dig deeper into Raymond's life. They began interviewing everyone who had been close to him in the days leading up to his disappearance, hoping to uncover a motive for the murder. Raymond's girlfriend was one of the first people they spoke to. She tearfully explained that Raymond had been living a dangerous life in recent years. He had dropped out of high school, gotten involved in drugs, and had been running with the wrong crowd. She mentioned Cyril Smith, a name that seemed to come up again and again during the investigation. Raymond's friends told a similar story. They spoke of Cyril as a man with a reputation for violence and drug dealing. He was known to hold grudges and had a volatile temper. It didn't take long for Alvarez and her team to zero in on Cyril as their prime suspect. But Cyril was nowhere to be found. A quick check of his known addresses revealed that he had skipped town, along with two of his associates, Jonathan Stormhill and Graham Ferguson. The investigation team now had a trail to follow, and they were determined to bring the killers to justice. The chase, tracking Cyril and his associates, wasn't easy. They had left New Mexico and were hiding out in Florida, using burner phones and fake identities to evade capture. But Alvarez's team was relentless. They scoured phone records, bank transactions, and surveillance footage, slowly piecing together Cyril's movements. The key breakthrough came when the team traced a series of phone calls made from Cyril's burner phone. The calls had been placed near the time of Raymond's disappearance, and one of them pinged a cell tower near Carson National Forest on the night Raymond's body had been dumped. That was the evidence they needed. Cyril and his associates had been in the forest the night of the murder. With this crucial piece of information, Alvarez's team was able to track Cyril to a motel in Florida, where they staged a raid and took him and his associates into custody. Interrogation and confession. Back in New Mexico, the interrogation of Cyril, Jonathan, and Graham began. At first, all three men denied any involvement in Raymond's death. They claimed they had left Albuquerque for Florida because they were tired of the lifestyle and wanted a fresh start. But Alvarez wasn't buying it. She pushed harder, focusing on Cyril. She knew he was the mastermind behind the crime, and it was only a matter of time before he cracked. After hours of relentless questioning, Cyril's calm exterior began to crumble. The pressure mounted, and eventually, Cyril broke. Cyril's confession. Detective Pamela Alvarez sat across from Cyril Smith in the dimly lit interrogation room, her steely gaze never leaving his face. The weight of silence hung thick in the air as Cyril shifted in his seat, trying to maintain his composure. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles white with tension. "Cyril, we've got you," Alvarez said softly, her voice calm but firm. "We know you were in Carson National Forest the night Raymond's body was dumped. We've traced your calls, matched your location. You can deny it all you want, but the evidence is piling up." Cyril leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he tried to calculate his next move. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, a man who knew how to cover his tracks. But now, sitting in front of this relentless detective, he realized his options were running out. "You're lying," Cyril muttered, his voice a mix of defiance and fear. "You got nothing on me." Alvarez leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "We have enough to put you away for a long time. But if you come clean now, we can talk about making things easier for you. Tell me what happened that night." For a moment, Cyril said nothing. His mind raced, replaying the events of that fateful night. He had always been in control, always the one giving the orders. But now, the cracks in his armor were showing. He knew the game was up. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," Cyril finally muttered, his voice barely audible. "It was just supposed to be a warning. Teach him a lesson." Alvarez nodded, letting the confession hang in the air before pressing further. "But it didn't stop there, did it?" Cyril's eyes flicked downward, unable to meet Alvarez's gaze. He wouldn't stop talking, wouldn't shut up about the money. "I lost it. I just lost it. We beat him, but I didn't mean to kill him." The room fell silent as Cyril's words sunk in, the weight of his confession filling the space. Alvarez knew this was just the beginning. In a cold, detached tone, he confessed to the kidnapping and murder of Raymond James. He admitted that it had all started as a plan to scare Raymond, to get back the money he was owed. But things had gone too far, and when Raymond died during the torture, Cyril had panicked. Jonathan's breakdown. Jonathan Stormhill sat hunched over in his chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the table in front of him. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow on his pale face. Detective Alvarez watched him carefully, sensing that Jonathan was on the verge of cracking. "You were there, Jonathan," Alvarez said gently, her tone shifting to one of understanding. "You saw what happened to Raymond. You can't carry this burden alone anymore." Jonathan's eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding Alvarez's gaze. He was young, only a few years older than Raymond had been. The guilt had been eating away at him ever since that night in the warehouse, gnawing at his conscience like a relentless predator. "I didn't want any part of it," Jonathan finally whispered, his voice shaky. "Cyril said it was just going to be a scare. Just rough him up a bit, you know." Alvarez nodded, encouraging him to continue. "But it got out of hand," Jonathan said, his voice breaking. "Cyril wouldn't stop. He just kept hitting him, and I didn't know what to do. Graham and we tried to stop him, but Cyril, he was out of control. By the time we realized what had happened, it was too late. Raymond was. He was gone." Jonathan's voice trailed off, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his confession. Alvarez could see the guilt written all over his face. This wasn't the hardened criminal Cyril was. Jonathan had been caught up in something he couldn't handle, and now he was drowning in regret. "You could have stopped him, Jonathan," Alvarez said softly. "But you didn't. And now Raymond's dead." Tears welled up in Jonathan's eyes, and for the first time, the full reality of what he had been a part of hit him like a tidal wave. Graham's reluctant truth. Graham Ferguson sat rigidly in his chair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Unlike Cyril and Jonathan, Graham had been quiet during the entire process, refusing to speak beyond basic denials. But now, Alvarez was ready to push him. "Jonathan's already talked," Alvarez began, watching for any sign of reaction. "He's told us everything. Cyril's gone down for this, but you still have a chance to tell your side." Graham's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he glared at the detective. "I didn't kill him," he spat, his voice cold and defensive. "That was all Cyril. But you were there, Alvarez pressed. You helped dispose of the body. You were part of this, Graham. You need to tell me why. For a moment, Graham remained silent, his face hard and unreadable. But Alvarez could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the crack in his tough exterior. It wasn't my idea, Graham muttered, his voice low. I didn't want any part of it, but Cyril made it clear that if we didn't help him, we'd be next. So you went along with it out of fear? Alvarez asked, her tone laced with skepticism. Graham hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Yeah, he said quietly. We were scared of him. Cyril wasn't someone you could say no to. Alvarez leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on Graham. And now Raymond's dead because you were too scared to stand up to him. Graham said nothing, his expression a mix of shame and bitterness. The truth was out, but the weight of his actions, and his inaction, would haunt him for the rest of his life. Justice served. With confessions from all three perpetrators, Detective Pamela Alvarez and her team were able to piece together the full story of Raymond James' tragic death. Cyril Smith was charged with first-degree murder, while Jonathan Stormhill and Graham Ferguson were charged as accessories to the crime. The case sent shockwaves through the community, a reminder of how easily a life could be destroyed by the reckless and dangerous actions of a few. For Raymond's family, the trial brought some measure of closure, but the loss of their son would never fully heal. As the years passed, the memory of Raymond James faded from the headlines, but his story remained a haunting reminder of the thin line between friendship and betrayal, and the devastating consequences of choosing the wrong path. The moral: Raymond James had made many mistakes in his life. He had fallen into bad habits, gotten involved in dangerous activities, and surrounded himself with people who didn't have his best interests at heart. But no one deserves to die the way Raymond did. His life was tragically cut short by people he had once considered friends. This case is a reminder of how dangerous the world of crime can be. It's a world where loyalty is fragile, trust is easily broken, and revenge can lead to devastating consequences. In the end, no amount of money or power was worth the life that was lost. And for Cyril, Jonathan, and Graham, their actions led to their downfall, with each of them facing life in prison for the murder of Raymond James. Thank you for joining us for this chilling episode of True Crime and Horror. Raymond James' story is a heartbreaking tale of friendship turned deadly, and a stark reminder of the dangers that come with living a life of crime. Be sure to subscribe for more stories like this one, and stay safe out there. Until next time, take care, and remember to keep an eye on the shadows, because sometimes, the truth is more terrifying than fiction.